As they say down east, there's a real nor'easter blowing here, or something like that. You know, the only thing I can do in the New England accent is my past life name. But that's also the case for my handwriting. I can barely try to imitate my past life handwriting, but I've always had a longing to write like that. So I've always had a longing to imitate accents, but I can't really do it. This morning, I'm going to share with you one of Matthew's novels. We're going to have a little story hour. I'm going to read the whole first chapter. And this is called The Mistake of a Lifetime. There's a great deal of context. I've talked about context in a work that's when you've got the original author and you've got it right instead of a plagiarist. There's a tremendous context, and there isn't with a plagiarist. So there's a tremendous context with this, both personal and professional. I won't go so much into the personal element, except that where a beautiful young girl is described in any of Matthew's stories, it's always Abby, in one form or another. So the girl you'll see here is Abby, who Matthew fell in love with and began courting when she was 15. So whenever there's a young woman like that, that's Abby. The other thing I should bring in on this story briefly is that this is going to be a kidnapping, but it's not what it looks like. This is the father and a friend of his rescuing his long-lost daughter from a den of thieves. So don't think that I'm promoting or that Matthew was promoting kidnapping in this. I'm going to apologize. I'm going to go ahead and blow my nose on camera here. When the toilet paper and Kleenex paper shortage hit, I began using hand towels as Kleenexes, and I've gotten into the habit now. I actually like them better. I might as well just be a full-blown eccentric. So we're going to just launch right into this. I'm going to go ahead and read it straight through, the first chapter, which is not very long. All of these chapters are short. This is set in London, but I do want to give the professional background a little bit, because like I said, the personal one is very deep, because Matthew felt that there were certain mistakes that he made in life that he wished that he could redo. And I think that this novel addresses those things in a kind of a roundabout way. It's a very complicated plot. It does work out all in the end if you read the whole book. The professional background of this is that Matthew had written a great many foreign adventure stories. A Christmas Carol was not the only story that he set in foreign lands. This one is also set in London, but he'd written a great many of them going way back to the, early 1840s anyway. And one or two of those were signed with his own signature. So we know that he could write and write very well in that genre. It's not just speculation, because fortunately he signed some of them. In 1848, as best as I've been able to extrapolate, Matthew was approached by two men, Francis A. Durivage and George Pickering Burnham. Now, Matthew had ghostwritten for Durivage in years previous, beginning, I believe, with a historical encyclopedia in 1835, which I have a copy of, and then several swashbuckling adventure novels, which Matthew probably, it was just for money, and he didn't even want to put his name on them. But Matthew couldn't write poorly, no matter what he did. So they're actually pretty good, despite the genre. Those were short novels, but then he wrote a great many stories on his own, and they're really excellent. I think he was attempting to do what John Townsend Trowbridge did, was to make his money on these adventure stories. For some reason, a great many of them weren't published. So I guess he was falling on hard times in 1848, and Durivage, whom he knew and had worked for, and a colleague, you could call him, a fellow thief, George Burnham, approached him, and I can only imagine the circumstances. They must have broken out the wine bottle, and they must have said, well, we'd like to publish some of your stories, but using our own name. See, because Durivage had always used his own name when Matthew ghost wrote for him. So Matthew, being short on cash and needing to support his second family, whom he'd separated. No, he hadn't quite separated from his second wife, That's a long story too, and I'm going to go to that grave and show you her grave at some point. Jane Vaughn was somebody that his mother apparently arranged for him to marry sight unseen, and it was a disaster. It was like she tricked him into it. I think she tricked him into it by telling him that Abby had come through in a seance and said that she wanted him to marry this person. There's a very long backstory to that. So anyway, he was toward the end of that marriage because he formally separated from her the following year in 1849. But anyway, he was trying to support his 3 kids, see? So he agreed to this deal. And in his mind, I'm sure he was going to select certain stories out of his portfolio going way back to 1830 and give them permission to publish those under their own name. So they handed him a contract, I'm guessing, and he signed it. And in the fine print of that contract, it gave them complete control to publish anything they wanted out of that portfolio. So they published the whole blasted thing all the way back to 1830 or so, things that Matthew would never have wanted to publish, things that were just practice sketches of anecdotes, things that were practice sketches for A Christmas Carol, which gives us these beautiful precursors, and things when he was still prejudiced, or at least writing in stereotypes, including black people and black dialect, which he stopped doing at some point because he realized that the pro-slavery people were using them for the wrong reasons and laughing at them hatefully instead of kind of wryly as Matthew did. So that's how I know that they go way back to 1830, because Matthew stopped writing like that. You know, when he fell in love with Abby and she influenced him, he stopped all of that. He became an abolitionist. See, before then, he was into colonization because he thought abolition was too dangerous. It'd be a bloodbath. So anyway, that's a long story. But what happened is that Francis Durivage and George Burnham published these things, partly under pen names of the Old 'Un, which is one of Matthew's favorite phrases, and the Young 'Un. And their fiction that they created was that Francis Durivage was the Old 'Un and George Burnham was his protege, the Young 'Un. See, well, it was all bullshit. They didn't write any of this stuff. Okay, there's a few of them that toward the end, I think Durivage tried to write on his own, and they're pretty bad. Durivage was a real sociopath, I believe. Burnham was just a crook. So they were partners in crime. Now, this is important because later on, Burnham attached his name to a book called The Rag Picker, Bound and Free, which Matthew also wrote anonymously. We'll get into that later on. I'll probably read some of that too. It's kind of like Uncle Tom's Cabin in that genre, and William Lloyd Garrison, who was Matthew's longtime friend and I think employer in the anti-slavery movement, glowingly reviewed that book. Anyway, here we are in 1850. This is Mistake of a Lifetime, and I'm going to go ahead and start reading from it. Let's see, I have dyslexia again. There we are. So there's one thing that I forgot to mention, and that is that Matthew had to see all of this work that he had done published under these crooks' names in the Flag of Our Union, and sometimes in Gleason's Pictorial, and in other papers. Spirit of the Times, I think George Burnham published in. And Matthew saw all of these. There wasn't anything he could do about it. Again, like with the Raven, he couldn't come out publicly and challenge them. And in this case, they had a contract, which he might or might not have been able to win a court case. But he couldn't come out publicly. And all of these wonderful stories that he had written were getting published under Francis Durivage's name. So what he did was anonymously, through an agent, submitted this story, The Mistake of a Lifetime, to Frederick Gleason, the man who owned those two papers, the Flag of Our Union in Boston and Gleason's Pictorial. And the agent played hardball financially, and he ended up getting $3,000 plus royalties. So Matthew was rich all of a sudden. And that's how he invested in the carpet bag a couple years, or 1 year later, the following year. That's another long story, the carpet bag. But Matthew was a financial silent financial partner, and this is how he did it, because he got $3,000, which is a huge amount of money in 1850. So Mathew was rich, and he had published this, but he published it under a pseudonym, Waldo Howard. So nobody paid any attention to it. His historians didn't pay any attention to it. The critics laughed up their sleeves, as he would have said, but they couldn't criticize the story because it's incredibly well written. What they made fun of was the amount that he was paid, because they thought it was a young fledgling author that had gotten his first book published by Gleason, and they imagined that he had somehow hypnotized Gleason into paying this huge amount of money for something that really wasn't that good, because they really hadn't read it. Well, there's a long story in that, and Mathew even went into heavy Yankee dialect and ridiculed the whole thing, so in defiance. See, in heavy dialect and heavy misspelling, like he used to use in Joe Strickland, the critics just made fun of the amount, not knowing that this was actually a seasoned author. So we're going to start now. The Mistake of a Lifetime, Chapter 1, The Tap Room of St. Giles. This is a quote from Shakespeare. Now let it work. Mischief, thou art afoot. Take then what course thou wilt. The street lamps were burning dimly in St. Giles, London, and the thick haze of night brooded over the eastern portion of the great metropolis with more than its wonted density. The vast, overgrown city was slumbering, or rather the more respectable portion of it were wrapped in the still mantle of sleep, while the noise and riotous dissipation that seemed indigenous to this section of the town came bursting forth in rude boisterousness and undefined sounds from the broken windows of the tottering tenements, and now from some damp cellar's mouth, half underground. The night police frequently passed in their rounds either end of the dark, narrow streets, but they seemed to give no heed to the turmoil and rioting, so long as it was confined within doors, and did not burst forth into the open light in the streets. They had become callous to these bacchanalian scenes and vulgar habits by intimacy with the people who inhabit these sections of the town, and did not care to interfere with them unless their duty and instructions compelled them to do so. It is here that we must introduce the reader in the opening of our story. The clock had already struck 10, one summer's night, when a couple of figures turned the corner from a large thoroughfare on George's in the Field, and quietly made their way down one of the narrow and dirty lanes referred to. They moved like persons who were fully aware of the vile character of the neighborhood, and who were on their guard to prevent being surprised, while the stealthiness with which they evidently picked their way through the riotous district seemed to indicate some delicate and peculiar object in view. There was quite a difference in the size of the two persons. The larger was dressed in a coarse top hat and cloth cap. The larger was dressed in a coarse top coat and cloth cap, with rough top boots, his figure presenting tokens of remarkable physical strength from the great breadth of shoulders and chest, and other signs that might have been seen in that dim, uncertain light. As he moved on, his gait discovered that he was lame, which rendered his walk somewhat awkward, though his step was quick and unyielding, notwithstanding this blemish. His companion must have been some years his junior, for his figure and bearing evinced the uncompleted frame of youth, though his form was stout and well-filled, and he walked like one who had the resolution and the strength to hold his ground in any emergency. As they passed now and then between the street lamps that were lit along the road at intervals, his face appeared much darker than the others, having a deep olive cast, such as imbues the skin in the tropics and the Indies. Like his elder companion, he was dressed in a coarse overcoat, cap, and top boots. Neither of them seemed to carry any weapons, though they were in such a dangerous section, yet they might have had arms concealed beneath their ample coats. They paused now for a moment, before one of the noisy houses that lined the street, and listened. I'm sorry, I was going to start that again. They paused now for a moment before one of the noisy houses that lined the street, and listened in silence to the sounds of revelry within. "This is the house. I have marked it well," said the elder of the two. "It is a dram shop," said the other, peering in at a crack. "Yes, and of the vilest kind. A sort of rendezvous for burglars and thieves," said the eldest, taking his stand where he could gain a view of the interior. "Half of them are drunk," continued the younger, still looking in at a crack of the crazy old building occupied for a tap room, so many of which abound in this locality. "Do you see the woman who keeps the shop, just behind that bar?" "Yes, fat as a porpoise," replied the other. Do you know her name?" "They call her Mother Giles," replied the elder of the two. "Is this where you were going in?" asked the younger. "Yes," said his companion. "We will enter quietly as possible and call for something to drink, and after that I will take the first opportunity to draw the old woman into conversation. If I can accomplish my object by gentle means and without force, why, all the better. But if we must, why, we must. At all hazards," he continued, with a meaning look at the other. "Hark, what is that?" "Only a drinking song." "With a chorus of broken china, I should think. There it goes again. Are you ready?" "Yes, lead on," said his companion, as they approached the low entrance. "Have your eyes about you and your arms ready, for these are desperate people." "I'm prepared." With these words of caution, the two entered the tap room. The drinking room referred to within the dilapidated building was on the first floor, and was one of those filthy gin shops that abound in the metropolis. There were 6 or 8 cutthroat-looking objects seated here and there in the room, and 3 of them were smoking together at a rough old table opposite the door whence the 2 persons referred to had entered. These 3 were evidently concocting some villainous rascality, as they talked in a hurried undertone, and often with much vehemence. Vehemency. The others seemed to be of less importance, and evinced the several stages of drunkenness, from the high excitement of the stimulus to the silliness of real inebriation, singing, laughing, and dozing by turns, quite forgetful of the miseries that each seemed heir to. Across one end of the apartment was erected a rough counter, greasy with filth, behind which were displayed a few bottles, decanters, and tumblers, the latter articles reversed with here and there a lemon upon them. And from this place the liquid poison was dealt out, a dram at a time. Sitting behind this rude bar was a woman half hidden in the cloud of bad tobacco smoke that she was most assiduously puffing from a pipe. She was a person of some 50-odd years of age, large and bloated with stimulus, while her face showed many a rough and ugly scar. One might easily read the reckless character that actuated her in a single glance of her small gray eyes. Though she sat there, to all outward appearances in perfect quiet, and intent solely upon the occupation of smoking and watching the ascending wreaths, yet a keen observer would have noticed that her small twinkling eyes were all about the room, watching for a chance to further her interests by selling a dram, or else to set some villainy afloat upon her customers. It was into such a scene as this that the 2 persons whom we have described now entered, and as they did so, there was no little stir evinced by the inmates of the room. The drunken ones paused in their revelry to ogle them. The 3 conspirators looked at them with an eye to business, and the old woman, knocking the ashes out of her pipe and looking about her small quarters, called through a side door for someone to come and wipe down a table for the gentlemen. "Whew! What an odious smell of onions," said the younger of the 2. "Keep your olfactories as well as your lips closed for the present," whispered the other. "Sit down, gentlemen, sit down," said the woman blandly. "Here at this table nearest the door," whispered the elder of the 2. The woman's summons brought into the room a young girl of some 13 or 14 years of age, but of most singular and striking beauty. Perhaps it was the contrast that the child afforded to the surrounding company and the place itself that startled the younger of the two newcomers, who gazed upon the girl with undisguised admiration. She was very coarsely dressed, but her sweet face would have shown its wealth of beauty through the most squalid covering of rags, while her form, yet so young and unmatured, was delicate and lovely in the extreme. Her half-plaintive, half-dejected expression, though it was evidence but too plain of her unhappy lot, yet added interest to the childlike beauty and innocence of her face. Here's a quote: "A pure, transparent, pale, and radiant face, like to a lighted alabaster vase." The elder of the newcomers, though he regarded the girl with no token of surprise, yet evinced no less interest and attention than his younger companion, and spoke to her most kindly as she wiped the rough table before them, and in a gentle voice solicited their orders. "That is the child of whom I spoke," said the elder of the two to the other, after he had given his order for a bottle of the best wine the house afforded. "You only said she was interesting, but this child is absolutely beautiful," said his companion, fixing his eyes once more upon the girl as she entered with the wine. "Do you think so?" "Yes, who would not?" "What is your name, my good girl?" asked the elder of the two. "Edith, sir," she answered, seemingly surprised at the tones of kindness. "Come hither." The child drew near to the table with a submissive air. "Have you been long in this place?" continued her interrogator. "Oh, yes," said the child with a sad and listless air. "How would you like to live with me in a nice house and be sent to school?" The child gazed for a moment at both the newcomers, as if she were saying in her own mind, "Does he ask such a strange question as that in earnest?" He who had asked her marked the expression of her face and studied it well. In a moment more she asked, "To school?" "Yes, and be taught to read and write like a lady, Edith." "Oh, I should like above all things to go to school," exclaimed the artless girl, as a beam of joy lighted up her pale face for a moment. "Perhaps we can get her permission to let you go," said the eldest of the two, nodding toward the woman at the bar, "and then I will take you from here." The child shook her head incredulously and faintly smiled. "Would you not like to go with me?" asked the gentleman. "I would like to go away from here anywhere," she said, sighing. "Never fear, you shall do so, my good girl," said her interrogator. "Ah, but she will not consent, I know," replied the child, looking towards the woman. "Do you think she would refuse if I offered her a handsome sum in gold?" "Hush," said the child timidly. "If you have any gold, do not mention it here." "Don't worry for me, my good girl. I will try presently and see what bargain I can make with the woman. Don't go far away, but be where you can follow us if I bid you." The child looked thankful, but shook her head, as much as to say that any effort to accomplish the object referred to would be useless, and at the same moment they were interrupted by a shrill call from the woman, who upbraided the girl in no moderate terms for her laziness, as she termed it, and with a rude volley of oaths sent her into the back room again to engage in some menial service. After sipping his wine, or rather pretending to do so for a few moments, the eldest of the two gentlemen, for their bearing seemed to entitle them to this appellation, though the coarseness of their dress was no evidence of their belonging to the better class, stepping up to the bar, commenced a familiar and apparently pleasant talk with the woman of the house, evidently relating to the young girl already referred to. The woman seemed much interested, but did not appear to concede the point, which the customer urged with much earnestness. In the meantime, the party at the opposite table were eyeing first the person who was talking at the bar, and then his companion, who was still seated before the wine. Neither of them were persons whom even a desperado would wish to attack unprepared, yet they seemed to be deciding in their minds whether the present was the best moment for such a purpose, or whether they should wait until longer. Their manner and conduct showed them to be burglars, highwaymen, or both, and they were soon whispering together in a way that showed conclusively that they had already formed some plan or design upon the newcomers. He who stood at the bar did not turn his back towards them even for a moment, but while he addressed the woman, though he seemed desirous that he should not be overheard, yet was careful at the same time to face the suspicious-looking party. "I am not deaf. You need not speak so loud," said the gentleman, a little ruffled. "But I tell you I will not let the girl go," repeated the woman, in reply to some remark of her customer. "I have good reason for it, and she will bring me twice the sum you offer within a couple of years from now, and besides, I get her labor into the bargain until then." "Very well, double the amount, then," said the gentleman. "Call it £100, and I'll pay you that and take her away tonight." "It won't do, £100 is not enough," said the woman, at the same time stealing an intelligent glance and nodding to the three opposite. The mention of the £100 was not lost upon the burglars, and the woman, as we have seen, took occasion to repeat the sum after him, so that they might understand that doubtless the man had that amount of money about his person at that very time. The truth was, she would without doubt have parted with the girl at the price named, and even for a much smaller sum, had she not expected to get the money or a part of it from the man, without giving any equivalent at all before he left the house. She was, of course, in league with the villains opposite, and was confident in her own mind of sharing in the expected spoils. Thus influenced, the old woman still demurred, and indeed seemed disinclined to part with the girl at all, or at any price. In the meantime, Edith was passing in and out of the room, constantly waiting upon the newcomers, for 3 others had now joined the party of burglars, and were listening to some hurried and whispered remarks in relation to the 2 gentlemen. At last, he who was talking to the woman seemed to give up his object in despair, and returning to his young companion at the table, he conversed with him in a low tone for some minutes. They were resolving in what way it would be best for them to proceed in order to gain their object, when they were interrupted by the approach of a stout 6-foot individual, much taller and larger than the rest of his party, and evidently their bully. This fellow abruptly approached their seats and declared in a blunt, insulting tone that he must have some of their wine. The youngest of the 2 gentlemen was on his feet in an instant and prepared for an assault, but at a significant look from his companion, he stepped back quietly to his seat again, though his flushed cheek showed that it cost him an effort not to resist the insult at once. "I say that I will have a glass of your wine," reiterated the bully. "You had better return to your friends peaceably," said the eldest of the gentlemen. "I seek no quarrel with you, but you cannot taste that wine." "Cannot? That was my word, sir." "We will see about that," said the bully, blustering towards the table. He was really a very powerful man physically, but the development of his figure, though evincing great strength, was rather bungling, showing his large limbs and a bloated figure with a preponderance of abdomen, while he who thus opposed them all presented exactly the opposite style of power. Small at the waist, with limbs neatly tapering in their formation, but with that breadth of chest and development of shoulders that showed how powerful were the muscles and sinews of the man. These tokens had not escaped the practiced eyes of the rogues, but then they were 3 to 1, and counted on an easy and bloodless victory in case of absolute opposition, which they scarcely anticipated under the existing circumstances, notwithstanding the bold front that was presented to their first advance. "You are determined to insult us, I see," continued the gentleman, perfectly calm. "Just as you please," said the bully. "It's all the same to me." "It will not be if you annoy me any further," said the gentleman. "Give me the wine," said the man, stretching forth his hand to take it from the table. But as the villain extended his arm, the gentleman raised himself to his full height, and with a blow given almost as quick as thought itself upon the head of the intruder, laid him lifeless at his feet. Two of the gang now rushed to their fallen comrade's assistance, but neither of them could strike a blow. Both lay prostrate upon the floor beside the other, apparently dead, with the blood streaming out from out their skulls. The gentleman removed himself instantly, and was no more discomposed than as though he had merely been at play. His cheek was unblanched, his hand was steady, and he breathed deeply and freely, with full self-possession. A volley of oaths escaped from the party opposite, who were maddened into rage, but yet did not advance from the position they held. "Perhaps there are more of ye that would like to be there," said the gentleman at last, with a bitter and scornful smile upon his lip. "If so, come on." After whispering together once more, the three desperadoes that were still left unharmed seemed about to make a simultaneous attack, but as they turned once more towards the two gentlemen, they found them prepared, and met the stern, unyielding eye of the extraordinary man bent keenly upon them as he said again, "Come on." A howl of mingled rage and oaths was the only response they uttered. The sight of three of their comrades lying insensible, if not dead, upon the floor, caused the others to hesitate and count the cost. It looked like a miracle to them to see three stout men, renowned fighters, accustomed to mingle daily and nightly in brawls of every character, thus overcome in an instant by a single arm. The insult that the first had offered was not, of course, for the sake of the wine itself, but as an excuse whereby to start a quarrel with the strangers, and then in the melee to rob them. All this time the woman looked on in profound astonishment, but ventured not a word, while the drunken party, with a sort of natural instinct, withdrew to the farthest corner. "If the girl comes in again," said the elder gentleman to his companion in an undertone, "seize upon her gently, but be sure to retain her. Tell her that we are her friends, and that she must go with us. I will open a way if it be necessary. Loosen your pistols now, though they must not be used except as the very last resort." "I understand," said his companion, putting his hands into his coat pockets for a moment, where a quick ear might have heard the half-cock of a pistol's lock. "Who are you?" asked one of the gang, now approaching the two, yet taking good care to keep out of reach of the arm that had felled his companions. "That concerns you not," said the elder of the two. "We are here on our own business, and be assured we shall perform it. Unless you wish to share the fate of those fools upon the floor, you had best keep well out of my way, or you will follow suit." The man had not the courage to tempt his fate, and so retired to his party. Thus completely intimidated by the stern and resolute front of the stranger, the party once more retired to a corner of the apartment to consult. Had they dared to use their firearms, they would have done so at once, but this they rarely ventured upon, for they knew full well that the first discharge and report would bring the police down upon them in force. In the meantime, startled by the noise she had overheard, caused by the conflict, Edith's curiosity had brought her into the room, when the younger of the gentlemen seized her by the arms and drew her to his side. He told her that they were her friends, and that if she would go with them, they would protect and cherish her. Edith believed him at once, for there was truth written on every line of his frank, open countenance, and so far from attempting to release herself, she only clung more closely to his side, while the old woman fiercely ordered her away to the other room. "Edith!" screamed the woman in a towering passion. The child hesitated, but her companion held her firmly. "Edith, come away! I will flay you alive!" continued the hag. Long custom had rendered the child so obedient to the woman's authority that she almost struggled with him who now held her, in order to obey the rude summons that was made upon her. But a few quieting and encouraging words from her new friend pacified her, and she remained quiet by his side, notwithstanding the almost frenzied rage and threats of the woman behind the bar. "Now is the time," said the eldest of the two. "Get into the street as soon as possible and hurry away. Don't mind me. I'll bring up the rear, but don't loose your hold of the child. If anything happens to me, take her to the house and take care of her. Remember." This was said in a hurried whisper between a lull of the noise and confusion, and having secured possession of the child, The two began gradually to make their way towards the door, near which fortunately they had been sitting. But a new phase was now upon the matter by the woman, who appealed to her friends to know if they were going to look tamely on and see her servant kidnapped before their very eyes, not lift a hand to prevent it, nor lift a hand to prevent it. Thus aroused, the burglars seemed to resolve upon one more assault upon the strangers, but he who had already proved so fatal to their companions receded slowly backwards, never taking his eye from them. He knew very well the game they would now play. They had learned by experience, and now his enemies came on more cautiously and all together. It was the only way that promised them success. He saw that it would be fatal to permit them to attack him in this way, and with a wonderful display of strength and agility, he sprang among them, felling another to the floor, and with one blow breaking the arm of a fifth person so that it hung useless by his side. The other desperado had been dealt with by the younger of the two, who seemed scarcely less at home than the other. This bold repulse was decisive, and amid the frowns and curses that saluted their ears, the gentlemen and their charge made their way into the street. The curses and oaths of the woman followed them to the last, to the no small consternation of the girl, who seemed to dread her more than all else. "Rest on me, Edith," said the younger of the two men, drawing the trembling arm of the child within his own, and half supporting her as they hurried along. "Thank you, sir," she replied, striving to keep up with her companion, who was hurrying with no little speed from the vile neighborhood. "We will soon be clear of this place, and you will have nothing to fear," he continued, striving to cheer the child as they went. "Are they following us?" she asked, startled by a sound behind them. No, but I hear footsteps. It's your imagination, Edith. I'm sure it's them." "No, that is our friend," replied her companion, half turning the child that she might see that he who followed was the person who had rescued her. "Keep to the left," said the person behind, as they turned from the street. "Here are the police, and we need hurry no more," replied his companion. "Aye," said the other, "but I do not care to be questioned even by them. So cross over and pass along quietly. I will join you a few squares further up the street." It was not until the three had turned out of this second street into a large thoroughfare that the person who had borne the brunt of the combat unwound from his wrist a small Indian netting, into the end of which was woven a leaden shot of 3 or 4 pounds weight, so arranged as to be hidden in the palm of the hand. A weapon at that time almost unknown in England, but in very common use in India. The secret of his effective and fatal blow was at once explained. They were performed with the slungshot. That is chapter 1. Now, the critics, as I said, made fun of this, and the picture that they painted was that this young fledgling author with his first novel approached Frederick Gleason, and Gleason started reading, and the further he got into the book as he was reading, the more money he offered for it, until finally he said, no, wait, take 3,000, Well, there's probably some truth to that, because this thing pulls you in immediately, and then you're somewhere else, and then how does this fit with that, and how does that fit with that, and all of these different elements somehow finally come together at the end, and so on and so forth. I won't go into the whole plot. It's very complicated. But Matthew's idea was he would create a master story, a master novel that would outdo anything that Francis Durivage had stolen from him. And it worked. It worked with bells on. So Matthew was quite capable of writing commercially when he wanted to. And I think in defiance, he finally decided, okay, I'll show him what I can do. And he made more money with that book than Francis Durivage made with any of the pieces that he'd stolen from Matthew, I think. So there you have A Mistake of a Lifetime. There's other novels that Matthew wrote. There's Bound and Free, which I'm going to read from at some point. There's another novel, Harry Lee, The Tempter and the Tempted, that Matthew published in 1863 under his own initials, MFW. It's a children's story, a story for boys. And it particularly relates to his own childhood. And someday I may read a little of that and get into that one. There's all of the short novels that Matthew wrote for Francis Durivage, which are kind of along this line, which I may not talk about so much. So again, Mathew Franklin Whittier has a long track record. Now, I just noticed that 3 people yesterday, apparently they're 3 different people, because I think that's the way the stats work in Academia EDU, read my paper or some portion thereof, an overview of the true literary legacy of Mathew Franklin Whittier. So it had 3 readers just yesterday, which suggests to me that somebody read it and sent it to a friend, and he sent it to a friend, or he sent it to 2 friends, something like that. That happened once with my documentary, by the way. One professor was so impressed with my documentary that he told me he had written to 75 of his colleagues. So every once in a while I break through. See, well, this is outrageous, because if you read the literary legacy of Mathew Franklin Whittier, you understand the whole picture, and you understand that when I say that he wrote The Raven, and when I say that he was the co-author of A Christmas Carol and the other outrageous famous claims, when you put it in context, you see it's perfectly plausible. It's not only plausible, it's predictable, because somebody with this kind of talent could definitely do those things. And then you look into it a little further and you find out that Dickens was a phony. He didn't write that. He only pretended to have written that. He just reworked it. And Edgar Allan Poe never touched the first one that was submitted to American Review. He never touched that at all. Matthew submitted that anonymously. The one he submitted, he changed a little bit. The one that he published in the New York Evening Mirror, but he took out one of Matthew's favorite words that I can demonstrate Matthew used at least 22 times in the course of his career, sublunary. Poe took that out. That's evidence enough that people should take what I'm saying seriously. Just that one clue, and I've got like 17, 18, 19 clues like that, one of which I just shared with you very recently. I don't know if any of you looked up the Latin in that quote that I shared with you, but the piece that was right above, that was Matthew's in his typical style. The one below was a poem in satire, satirizing Edgar Allan Poe. And the Latin tells you what he really thought of Poe. Look it up. Anyway, so this is going to be hugely long. Probably nobody in 2021 is going to watch all this, or maybe 1 or 2 people. But I'm going to go ahead and do this for posterity, if not for anybody currently. But eventually people are going to start reading that article. And eventually they're going to want to go back and read the other articles when it sits, and they 2 or 3 years from now, they'll run across things that trigger their memory of that article, and they'll realize, God, I think he was real. I think he was right, So they'll go back and read the article that talks about Matthew's childhood work as a prodigy, and they'll go back and they'll read about Abby's work, and so forth and so on. And then this article that I'm coming out with in Real Paranormal Magazine, it's like a 49-page article, and it's all about Charles Dickens, A Christmas Carol, and Mathew Franklin Whittier and Abby Poyen Whittier. I put a lot of evidence in that article. If you read that whole article, point after point after point after point, it's obvious. This is what I'm saying. These things are obvious. So eventually I'll break through. And the reason that I know I'm going to break through is because those 3 people in one day read that article. That means it is coming to their attention. We're now at 95 reads, so for about a year or something like that, a little less than a year. So it's happening slowly but surely. So that is the mistake of a lifetime. As I said, there's a great deal of very deeply personal. Already we've been introduced to Abby. You'll see at least one other character where he also describes Abby, and 2 other characters actually. So Abby keeps coming in, and kind of like the way they say when you reincarnate, there's patterns that keep appearing over and over. Well, Matthew's deeply personal life keeps appearing over and over in his fiction. So there's a great deal in there that I understand that I won't try to deconstruct now, but you can find that book online. I believe the Hathi Trust has got it. If archive.org doesn't have it, I'm almost 100% sure that either Google Books or the Hathi Trust has it. So you can read it for yourself and download it for yourself. I have 4 copies of this. I think there's at least one more copy in Abe Books for if you have $60. If you're young and you think you might live for another 60 years or so, that $60 copy of that thing is going to be worth 100,000 someday. I think that's really grandiose of me, but I'm telling you the truth. When it's understood that I'm not blowing smoke and that everything I'm saying is substantially correct, that original copy, this original copy is going to be worth a fortune. Of course, it's not going to do me any good in this lifetime because I've only got another maybe 10, 15, 20 years max, if I get to be ancient. So I hope you enjoyed that. There'll be more. You obviously can sample these and click out of them anytime you feel like. And thank you once again for watching.